The first lie every rich family tells is that the house is quiet because everyone is happy. I learned the truth on my very first morning. The iron gates of the Moretti estate opened with a slow metallic hum that sounded more like a warning than a welcome. I tightened my grip on the worn leather handle of my duffel bag and drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic through the entrance, feeling as though my little car had wandered into a world where it didn't belong. The driveway stretched for what felt like half a mile, lined with towering oak trees whose branches formed a tunnel over the pavement. Beyond them stood the mansion itself, all white stone, black-framed windows, and carefully trimmed hedges that looked too perfect to be real. It wasn't just a house. It was the kind of place people whispered about without ever mentioning names. I parked beside a row of expensive SUVs that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. Before I could even step out, the front door opened. A woman in her 60s walked toward me wearing a charcoal gray dress that somehow looked as formal as a business suit. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades keeping impossible things under control. "Claire Bennett?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Evelyn. Head housekeeper. Follow me." She never smiled, but she wasn't unkind either. Inside, the mansion smelled faintly of cedar wood, polished marble, and fresh coffee. Sunlight poured through enormous windows, painting golden patterns across the black and white marble floor. Everything echoed, even our footsteps, as though the house wanted to remind visitors how small they really were. I had cleaned luxury homes before. Nothing like this. Paintings covered the walls. Crystal chandeliers reflected tiny rainbows across the ceilings. Fresh flowers sat in every hallway, perfectly arranged without a single wilted petal. It looked less like a home and more like a museum where people somehow still lived. Evelyn handed me a folded uniform. "Breakfast begins at 7. Staff dinner is at 6. Bedrooms on the west wing are off limits unless instructed otherwise." I nodded carefully, trying to memorize every word. She stopped walking beneath a sweeping staircase that curved toward the upper floors. Then her expression changed for the first time. It wasn't fear exactly. It was caution. "One more rule," she said quietly. "Never go to the third floor." I looked up automatically. The staircase continued into shadows where another hallway disappeared behind dark wooden doors. "Why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Evelyn met my eyes for several long seconds. "Because if Mr. Moretti wants you there, he'll ask." That answer explained absolutely nothing. Before I could say another word, the deep chime of an antique grandfather clock echoed through the entrance hall. Somewhere farther inside the mansion, I heard footsteps. Slow. Measured. Heavy enough to silence every other sound in the building. Every employee nearby instinctively straightened their posture. Conversations ended. Coffee cups stopped moving. I turned toward the hallway just as a tall man dressed in a tailored black suit appeared beneath the morning light. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his blue-gray eyes unreadable, and there was something about the way he walked that made the enormous house seem as though it belonged to him alone. He never looked in my direction. Not once. Yet somehow, as he passed only a few feet away, I had the unmistakable feeling that he already knew exactly who I was. My first day settled into a rhythm that almost convinced me Evelyn had been overly dramatic. I dusted bookshelves that looked as though no one had touched them in years, polished silver trays until I could see my reflection, and folded linen napkins with corners sharp enough to satisfy even her impossible standards. The other employees spoke politely, but never loudly, and every conversation seemed to end the moment footsteps echoed nearby. It was as if the entire household had learned to breathe quietly. By early afternoon, I had memorized half the West Wing and still had not seen Adrian Moretti again. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the weight of his presence that morning. Then Evelyn assigned me to refresh the library before dinner. The room was larger than my entire apartment back in Queens. Floor-to-ceiling shelves wrapped around dark walnut walls, interrupted only by tall windows overlooking acres of perfectly trimmed gardens. A fire crackled softly despite the mild weather outside, giving the room a warmth that contrasted with the rest of the mansion. I replaced fresh flowers on a side table and reached for a stack of books someone had left open. One title caught my attention. It was not about business or finance like I expected. It was a history of classical architecture, filled with handwritten notes in neat blue ink. Whoever owned it had underlined entire passages and scribbled thoughtful questions in the margins. It felt strangely human. Before I could read another line, voices drifted in from the hallway. Instinct told me to leave, but I had nowhere to go without crossing directly in front of them. I quietly stepped behind one of the towering bookshelves, intending to wait only a few seconds. The library doors opened. "You are making a mistake," an older man's voice said, calm but firm. "Sentiment has never protected this family." Adrian answered, his tone low and controlled. "Neither has fear." I could not see either of them clearly, only fragments through the narrow spaces between books. The older man wore an expensive navy suit and carried himself with effortless confidence. Silver hair framed a face that might have looked kind under different circumstances, but there was something calculating behind his smile. "The board expects certainty," he continued. "They do not expect compassion." Adrian remained silent for several seconds before replying. "Then perhaps they should learn the difference." The room fell so quiet I could hear the logs shifting inside the fireplace. The older man chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in the sound. "Your father used to believe people could be trusted too." Adrian's answer came immediately. "That belief cost him everything." My breath caught. Whatever history lived inside those words was far older than this conversation. The older man sighed. "One day you will realize that loyalty is rented, not earned." Footsteps crossed the hardwood floor toward the exit. I relaxed too soon. As I stepped backward, my elbow brushed against a brass globe sitting on a display stand. It spun with a soft metallic scrape that sounded deafening in the silent library. My heart stopped. The footsteps outside froze instantly. Neither man spoke. I stared at the floor, willing myself to disappear. Then Adrian's voice broke the silence. "Who is in there?" There was no anger. No raised voice. Somehow that made it worse. I slowly stepped out from behind the bookshelf with my hands folded in front of me. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I was changing the flowers." I heard voices and did not want to interrupt. The older man studied me with polite curiosity, but Adrian looked directly into my eyes for the first time. His expression revealed nothing. After several endless seconds, he glanced toward the history book still resting open on the table, then back at me. "Did you read it?" he asked quietly. I could have lied. Every instinct told me that lying would be safer. Instead, I swallowed hard and answered with the only truth I had. "Only one page." But whoever wrote in the margins loved buildings more than money. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. Adrian did not answer immediately. His blue-gray eyes stayed on mine long enough that I forgot how to breathe. I had expected irritation, maybe even a quiet lecture from the owner of the house I had nearly embarrassed myself in. Instead, he glanced down at the open book resting on the table. His fingertips brushed the worn leather cover with surprising care before he closed it. "It was my mother's," he said. The words were simple, almost weightless, but something changed in the room after he spoke them. The older man folded his hands behind his back and studied me with renewed interest. "Most people notice the artwork first," he said. "Or the value of the collection." I shook my head. Books that are displayed perfectly are usually decoration. This one has folded corners. Someone actually read it. A faint smile almost appeared on the older man's face before disappearing just as quickly. Adrian looked at him without saying a word. Whatever passed between them happened silently. Finally, the older man adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "I will see you tomorrow," he said. "Think carefully about our conversation." Adrian gave a single nod. The library doors closed behind the older man, leaving only the crackling fireplace and the uncomfortable awareness that I was now completely alone with the man everyone in the house seemed to fear. I lowered my eyes. I am sorry for overhearing your conversation. You did not answer my question, Adrian said calmly. My stomach tightened. Which question? Why did you tell the truth? I blinked. Because you asked me. Most people do not. His voice carried no arrogance, only quiet certainty, as though years of experience had taught him exactly what to expect from others. I searched for the safest answer but found none. I cannot remember every lie I tell, I admitted softly. It is easier to remember the truth. For the first time, I noticed the smallest change in his expression. It was not amusement. It was curiosity. His eyes lingered on my face for another second before he walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Rain clouds had gathered outside, casting long gray shadows across the lawn. How long have you worked in private homes? He asked without turning around. Almost 4 years. And what did you do before that? I hesitated. Community college. I studied interior design until I could not afford tuition anymore. He finally looked back at me. That explains the architecture book. Heat rushed to my face. Old habits are difficult to lose. Another silence settled between us, but this one felt different. Less threatening. Almost thoughtful. Then a sharp whistle echoed from somewhere outside the mansion, followed by frantic barking. Adrian turned toward the sound instantly. His calm expression hardened, though he never raised his voice. A few seconds later, one of the security staff hurried into the library. Sir, the man said carefully. The new rescue dog slipped its leash near the south garden. Adrian nodded once. Do not chase him. He will only run farther. The guard disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. Before I realized what I was saying, the words left my mouth. If he is frightened, crouch instead of standing over him. Most rescue dogs come back when someone stops looking like a threat. Adrian looked at me again, this time with genuine surprise. You know dogs? I volunteered at an animal shelter every Saturday for 3 years. Without another word, he walked past me toward the hallway. Halfway through the doorway he stopped. Come with me, Claire. It was the first time he had spoken my name, and somehow it sounded less like an order than the beginning of something neither of us understood. The rain had started by the time we stepped outside, soft enough to leave tiny silver circles across the stone walkway but steady enough to blur the gardens into shades of green and gray. Adrian walked several steps ahead of me with his hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat while 2 security men remained far enough behind that they almost disappeared among the trees. No one spoke. Even the silence felt organized. Then I heard the barking again. It came from somewhere near a maze of tall hedges surrounding the south garden. The sound was nervous rather than aggressive, the desperate warning of an animal that had decided the world could no longer be trusted. Adrian stopped beside the entrance to the hedge maze. He was rescued 2 days ago, he said quietly. The shelter warned us he had been abandoned more than once. I looked toward the narrow path disappearing between perfectly trimmed walls of ivy. Then chasing him will only convince him that people always come to take something away. Adrian gave one short nod. Show me. I slipped off my light jacket and handed it to him before walking slowly into the maze. Every instinct I had learned at the shelter returned without effort. Slow steps. Relaxed shoulders. Quiet breathing. I crouched near a small stone fountain and waited. At first there was nothing except rain tapping gently against the leaves. Then I caught movement beneath a wooden bench. A medium-sized golden shepherd mix stared back at me with frightened amber eyes. Mud covered his paws, and his ears stayed pressed tightly against his head. Hey, sweetheart, I whispered. Nobody is mad at you. He did not move. I looked away instead of staring directly at him. That always helped. After nearly a minute, I stretched one hand toward the wet grass, keeping it low enough that he could choose the distance himself. Another minute passed. Then another. Finally, I heard tiny paws pressing against damp gravel. The dog crept forward one careful step at a time until his nose reached my fingertips. I smiled without making a sound. Good boy. His tail twitched once. Then twice. Before long he rested his head gently against my knee with a sigh so deep it almost sounded like relief. I clipped the loose leash back onto his collar and slowly stood. When I turned around, Adrian was watching from several yards away. Not the dog. Me. The expression on his face was impossible to read, but there was none of the cold distance I had noticed that morning. He accepted the leash when I reached him, yet the dog immediately leaned back toward my side instead. One of the security men laughed softly. Looks like he made his choice. Adrian glanced at the dog before answering. Perhaps he recognizes kindness faster than people do. We began walking back toward the mansion at an easy pace. Halfway across the garden, a small red ball rolled through the wet grass and stopped near my shoe. I bent to pick it up just as a little boy, no older than 7, emerged from behind a row of flowering shrubs. His sandy brown hair was damp from the rain, and he froze the moment he noticed Adrian standing beside me. The smile vanished from his face almost instantly. He lowered his eyes and wrapped both arms around himself without saying a word. Adrian's posture softened in a way I would never have believed possible. Ethan, he said gently. You should be inside. The boy nodded but still did not speak. Instead, he looked at me for one brief moment before reaching out for the red ball. His fingers brushed mine for less than a second. Hidden beneath the sleeve of his little sweater was a colorful friendship bracelet woven from blue and green thread. The name stitched into it caught my attention immediately. It did not say Ethan. It said Noah. I could not stop thinking about the bracelet. The blue and green threads had been faded from years of wear, but the stitched letters had been clear enough that I knew I had not imagined them. Noah. Not Ethan. The little boy disappeared into the mansion before I could ask a single question, and somehow I already understood that asking questions inside the Moretti estate was the fastest way to stop receiving answers. Dinner preparations began an hour later, filling the kitchen with the comforting scent of roasted rosemary, fresh bread, and garlic butter. It was the first place in the mansion that felt almost ordinary. Chefs argued quietly over timing. Servers polished wine glasses. Someone laughed at a joke before immediately remembering where they worked and lowering their voice. Evelyn handed me a silver serving tray. You will assist in the private dining room tonight. I nearly dropped the tray. Me? She gave a brief nod. Mr. Moretti requested it. Several employees looked up at the same time. One young housekeeper blinked twice before returning to folding napkins. Another exchanged a puzzled glance with one of the servers. I could feel the questions they refused to ask out loud. Why the new girl? Why today? I wished I knew. The private dining room overlooked the western gardens where the rain had finally stopped. Candles reflected softly against crystal glasses, making the room glow with warm golden light. Adrian sat alone at one end of the long walnut table, reading several documents while untouched coffee cooled beside his hand. He barely looked up when I entered. Good evening, sir, I said. Good evening, Claire. He already knew my footsteps. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I began placing each course exactly as Evelyn had taught me, careful not to make unnecessary noise. Halfway through arranging the silverware, I noticed another place setting across from Adrian. Smaller plate. Smaller glass. A folded blue napkin. Someone else was expected. Right on cue, quiet footsteps approached the doorway. The little boy from the garden stood there wearing a navy sweater and clean sneakers. His hair was still slightly damp from the afternoon rain. Adrian looked toward him with unmistakable patience. Come join me. The boy obeyed immediately but never spoke. He climbed into his chair, folded his hands in his lap, and stared at the table. Adrian waited almost a full minute before beginning the meal, as though silence itself deserved respect. I served warm soup first. When I reached the boy, he hesitated before looking up at me. His eyes were cautious but no longer frightened. I smiled gently. Careful. The bowl is warm. He gave the smallest nod. During dinner, Adrian asked simple questions about school, favorite books, and whether the dog had finally settled into his new bed. The little boy answered every question without using a single word. One nod meant yes. Two meant no. Sometimes he pointed. Sometimes he simply smiled. Adrian accepted every answer without frustration. It was a language the two of them had clearly practiced for a long time. As I collected the empty soup bowls, the boy accidentally bumped his spoon onto the hardwood floor. The sharp clink echoed across the quiet room. He froze instantly. His shoulders stiffened, and he lowered his head as though expecting to be scolded. Instead, Adrian calmly picked up the spoon, placed it beside the plate, and spoke so softly I almost missed the words. Accidents are not emergencies. The tension left the child's face almost immediately. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Whatever this house had been before, someone was trying very hard to make it different now. As I reached for the empty bread basket, the boy glanced toward me and, for the first time since I had met him, he whispered a single word so quietly it barely rose above the flickering candles. Thank you. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes from his plate and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not surprise that the boy had spoken. It was surprise that he had chosen to speak to me. The single whispered thank you lingered in the room long after dinner ended. No one mentioned it. Not Adrian. Not the servers clearing the table. Not even Evelyn when she quietly instructed everyone to finish the evening routine. Yet I noticed something different in the way the staff looked at the little boy as he walked beside Adrian toward the east hallway. There was hope where I had only seen careful professionalism before. As I gathered the last crystal glasses, Evelyn approached me carrying a folded linen cloth. Mr. Moretti would like you to help organize the family reading room tomorrow afternoon, she said. The reading room? She nodded once. Only a few employees are assigned there. Before I could ask another question, she was already walking away. The next morning arrived wrapped in soft sunlight after the previous day's rain. The garden sparkled beneath thousands of tiny drops clinging to every leaf. Birds filled the air with quiet songs that somehow made the enormous estate feel less intimidating. I spent the morning polishing antique picture frames, arranging fresh flowers, and replacing books that had been returned overnight. Around noon, I carried a basket of clean towels toward the family wing. As I passed an open sitting room, I heard laughter. It was small. Hesitant. But unmistakably a child's laugh. Curious, I slowed my steps just enough to glance inside without being obvious. Ethan sat on the floor beside the rescue dog, gently rolling the same red ball across an expensive Persian rug. Adrian was sitting in an armchair nearby with a book resting open on his lap, although I noticed he had not turned a page in several minutes. He was watching the boy instead. The dog barked once and chased the ball across the room before dropping it back into Ethan's lap. Another quiet laugh escaped him. Adrian smiled. It was brief enough that someone blinking might have missed it, but it completely transformed his face. For the first time, he looked less like the powerful man who owned the mansion and more like someone simply grateful for an ordinary afternoon. I quickly continued walking before anyone noticed me. A few minutes later I reached the reading room Evelyn had mentioned. Shelves filled with novels, history books, and children's stories surrounded a wide stone fireplace. A small wooden train sat neatly beside one armchair. Coloring books rested on a low table along with sharpened colored pencils arranged by shade. The room had clearly been designed for someone young. As I dusted the shelves, I found another framed photograph tucked between two heavy volumes. It showed Adrian several years younger standing beside a smiling woman with auburn hair and kind green eyes. Between them stood the same little boy, younger but unmistakably Ethan. I carefully picked up the frame to wipe away a thin layer of dust. On the back, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Home is never a place. It is the people who wait for you." Before I could return the picture to the shelf, footsteps approached behind me. I turned expecting Evelyn. Instead, it was the silver-haired man from the library. His pleasant smile returned instantly, but his eyes never matched it. "You must be Claire," he said warmly. "I am Victor Moretti, Adrian's uncle." I greeted him politely, setting the photograph back exactly where I had found it. His gaze drifted toward the frame for the briefest moment before returning to me. "My nephew seems unusually interested in your opinions," he observed. "That is rare." I searched for a careful answer. "I only try to do my job well." Victor chuckled softly. "Sometimes doing your job well changes far more lives than you expect." He straightened his jacket and walked toward the doorway, then paused without looking back. "One piece of friendly advice, Claire. In this family, the people who notice the smallest details often discover the largest secrets." After he disappeared down the hallway, I looked once more at the photograph on the shelf. For reasons I could not explain, his words felt less like advice and more like a warning. Victor's warning followed me for the rest of the afternoon like an echo I could not silence. I told myself he was simply an older man who enjoyed speaking in riddles, but every time I dusted another shelf or straightened another chair, I found myself replaying his exact words. The people who notice the smallest details often discover the largest secrets. I had not come to the Moretti estate looking for secrets. I had come because my rent was overdue, my savings account barely covered 2 months of groceries, and this job paid almost twice what I had earned anywhere else. Still, the house seemed determined to tell its own story one quiet piece at a time. Just before sunset, Evelyn asked me to prepare coffee for an evening meeting in the West Conference Room. "Mr. Moretti prefers black coffee," she reminded me. "His guests have their own preferences written on the tray." I carefully arranged porcelain cups, polished silver spoons, fresh cream, and a small plate of almond cookies before carrying everything upstairs. As I approached the conference room, I noticed the heavy wooden doors were slightly open. Calm voices drifted into the hallway. Adrian was speaking with several men whose faces I had never seen before. Maps covered one wall, and folders were spread neatly across the long table. No one sounded angry. The conversation was measured, thoughtful, almost like executives discussing a business merger. I knocked softly before entering. Adrian looked up first. "Leave the coffee here," he said. I nodded and began placing each cup beside the correct seat. One guest thanked me politely. Another barely looked away from his paperwork. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until I reached the last place setting. According to the small handwritten card, that cup required sugar instead of artificial sweetener. I reached for the silver bowl beside the tray and immediately frowned. Something felt wrong. The sugar crystals looked unusually coarse, almost sparkling under the overhead lights. Years of helping my grandmother bake filled my mind with an odd certainty. This was not the fine white sugar people normally served with coffee. I stared at it for 1 second longer than I should have. Adrian noticed. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Every person at the table turned toward me. Heat rushed into my face. I wished I could explain what I was feeling, but I had nothing except instinct. I might be mistaken," I said carefully, "but this does not look like regular sugar." Silence settled across the room. One of the men smiled politely. "Sugar is sugar." I almost agreed. Almost apologized. Instead, I picked up a tiny silver spoon and examined the bowl more closely. "Would you mind if the kitchen replaced it?" Adrian watched me without blinking. "Why?" "Because if I am wrong, we lose 2 minutes." I swallowed before finishing. "If I am right, we lose nothing except this bowl." Another long silence followed. Finally, Adrian pushed his untouched coffee away. "Replace it." I hurried back to the kitchen where the pastry chef immediately frowned at the bowl. "This is not ours," he said. "We only use superfine sugar for the conference room." He opened another container from the pantry. The difference was obvious even to me now. The crystals were smaller, softer, completely different. Evelyn's expression turned serious. Who prepared the first bowl? No one answered immediately. Staff members exchanged confused glances. A few quietly checked inventory lists while others searched the pantry shelves. There was no shouting. No panic. Only growing uncertainty. When I returned with the replacement, Adrian accepted it with a brief nod. The meeting continued as though nothing had happened, but I noticed something else. One chair at the far end of the table remained empty. The handwritten name card resting beside the untouched coffee cup read only one word. Victor. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the untouched bowl of sugar sitting beside Victor's empty chair. Maybe it had been an honest mistake. Maybe someone had simply picked up the wrong container from storage. That explanation should have comforted me, yet something inside refused to settle. The mansion itself seemed restless. Hallway lights remained on later than usual, and I heard quiet footsteps outside my room long after midnight. By sunrise, everything appeared normal again, almost as though the previous evening had never happened. Breakfast preparations filled the kitchen with familiar sounds. Coffee brewed. Bacon sizzled. Fresh biscuits cooled on wire racks. The ordinary rhythm should have erased my worries, but I noticed Evelyn checking every ingredient before it reached the dining room. She did not explain why. She did not need to. Around 10 o'clock, Adrian found me arranging flowers in the front hall. "Walk with me," he said. There was no urgency in his voice, only calm certainty. I followed him through the east garden where roses climbed stone arches and fountains reflected the clear blue sky. The rescue dog trotted happily several yards ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff flowers before racing forward again. "You trusted your instincts yesterday," Adrian said without looking at me. Most people would have stayed silent. I watched the gravel beneath my shoes. I almost did. But you did not. We continued walking until we reached a quiet greenhouse filled with orchids and citrus trees. Warm sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, wrapping everything in soft gold. Adrian rested one hand on an old wooden table covered with gardening tools. "There is something you should know." His voice remained steady, but slower than usual. "People who work here become part of this household. I expect honesty from everyone, even when honesty is inconvenient." Before I could answer, hurried footsteps echoed across the stone path outside. One of the security officers appeared at the greenhouse entrance, breathing slightly faster than normal. "Sir," he said. "We have a situation near the north gate." Adrian's expression did not change. "Explain." "A delivery truck arrived without being scheduled. The driver insists the order was approved this morning." Adrian glanced toward me for only a fraction of a second before turning back to the guard. "No deliveries enter the estate unless Evelyn confirms them personally." The guard nodded and disappeared immediately. Adrian looked at me again. "Come." We reached the front courtyard within minutes. A large white delivery truck waited outside the main gate while two security officers spoke politely with the driver. Nothing looked unusual. Flowers decorated the company logo painted on the side of the truck, and stacks of wooden crates were visible through the open rear doors. Evelyn walked toward us holding a clipboard. "There is no order under this company name," she said quietly. The driver insisted there had been a misunderstanding and apologized several times before offering to leave. Everything seemed harmless until the rescue dog suddenly began barking. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just one sharp bark followed by another. His ears stood straight as he refused to move closer to the truck. Instead, he backed away and pressed against my leg. I remembered exactly how frightened he had been in the garden only days earlier. This was not fear. This was warning. I crouched beside him and gently rested one hand on his shoulder. His eyes never left the rear of the truck. Adrian noticed immediately. "Stop the vehicle," he said calmly. No one raised their voice. The driver cooperated without argument while security performed another careful inspection. A few quiet minutes later, one officer emerged carrying a small insulated container that had not appeared on the delivery manifest. He whispered something into Adrian's ear. Adrian thanked him with a brief nod before looking at me. There was no smile on his face, only quiet understanding. It seems, he said softly, that our newest employee has now saved this household twice without ever intending to. After the delivery truck left the estate, no one celebrated. There were no dramatic speeches, no congratulations, no visible relief. The staff simply returned to work with quieter voices than before. Even the rescue dog stayed unusually close to me for the rest of the afternoon, following me from room to room as though he had quietly appointed himself my shadow. Every so often I would look toward the front gates, expecting another unfamiliar vehicle to appear. None did. The mansion settled back into its polished routine, but beneath the calm surface I could feel something shifting. That evening, Evelyn stopped me just as I finished arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall. "Mr. Moretti would like to see you in the library." My heartbeat quickened immediately. I wondered if I had made another mistake without realizing it. The library was exactly as I remembered it, warm from the fire and filled with the comforting scent of old paper and cedar wood. Adrian stood near the tall windows overlooking the gardens with 2 coffee cups resting on the small table beside him. He motioned toward one of the chairs. "Please sit." It was the first time he had ever asked instead of instructed. I lowered myself into the leather chair while he handed me a cup of tea instead of coffee. "Evelyn mentioned you prefer chamomile in the evening." I blinked in surprise. She remembered that? She remembers everything. For a few quiet moments neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the fire crackled behind us. Finally Adrian broke the silence. "You have probably formed opinions about me." I almost laughed from nervousness. "I try not to form opinions about my employer." A faint smile crossed his face. "That sounds like an opinion." I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. "You seem different from what people outside this house would expect." He nodded slowly. "Most of them have never met me." His answer carried no bitterness. Only acceptance. He walked toward one of the bookshelves and removed a framed photograph I had not noticed before. It showed the same woman from the picture in the reading room, standing beside Adrian beneath autumn trees while Ethan sat on his shoulders laughing at something outside the frame. Adrian rested the photograph carefully on the table between us. Her name was Emma. Even saying her name seemed to soften his voice. She believed every problem could be solved if people were willing to listen long enough. I studied the picture quietly. "She looks kind." She was. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "She also believed that fear could silence a child more completely than any illness." My thoughts returned instantly to Ethan's quiet nods, his careful gestures, and the single whispered "thank you" at dinner. Is that why he rarely speaks? Adrian took a slow breath before answering. After Emma passed away 3 years ago, he stopped talking almost completely. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. Specialists tried everything. Some days he says one word. Some days none at all. I looked back at the smiling family captured forever inside the photograph. It was difficult to connect that happy moment with the quiet sadness that now filled the room. "He smiled today," I said gently. "When he was playing with the dog." Adrian nodded without taking his eyes off the picture. "That has become more frequent since you arrived." I did not know how to respond. I had only been kind because kindness had never seemed optional. He carefully returned the photograph to its place on the shelf before facing me again. "Claire," he said quietly, "there is something else you deserve to know. The bracelet you noticed on Ethan's wrist does not belong to him." My breath caught. Adrian continued in the same calm voice. "Noah was Emma's younger brother. Ethan has refused to take the bracelet off since the day of her funeral because he believes it helps him remember the sound of her voice." For a long time neither of us spoke. The fire continued its quiet rhythm while rain traced slow paths down the library windows. I kept thinking about a little boy holding on to a faded friendship bracelet because memories felt safer when they could be touched. It broke my heart in the gentlest possible way. He thinks if he takes it off, he will forget her, Adrian said, answering the question I had never asked aloud. I have never had the courage to tell him that love does not disappear with a bracelet. I looked at him carefully. Maybe he already knows that. Maybe he just needs something to hold until he believes it. Adrian's eyes remained on the flames. Emma used to say almost the same thing. The words settled between us with surprising warmth. It no longer felt like I was speaking to the distant owner of an enormous estate. I was speaking to a father who had spent years carrying grief without allowing anyone to help him carry it. The following morning the mansion prepared for another gathering. Fresh flowers arrived before sunrise. New table linens covered every dining table. Security staff quietly checked every entrance while caterers unloaded desserts into the main kitchen. Whatever meeting Adrian was hosting mattered enough for everyone to move with unusual precision. I spent most of the morning arranging floral centerpieces in the ballroom with Evelyn. She paused beside one arrangement and adjusted a single white rose by less than an inch. Perfection is usually a collection of very small corrections, she said. I smiled. My grandmother used to say almost the same thing about pie crust. Evelyn actually laughed, the sound so unexpected that I almost forgot where I was. I imagine I would have liked your grandmother. Before I could answer, Ethan wandered quietly into the ballroom carrying a coloring book beneath one arm. The rescue dog followed him faithfully. He looked around until his eyes found me. Without speaking, he walked over and gently tugged on my sleeve. Would you like help? I asked softly. He nodded. Together we sat beside one of the tall windows while he opened the coloring book. Instead of cartoon characters, every page contained sketches of houses, gardens, bridges, and trees waiting to be colored. He carefully handed me a green pencil before choosing a blue one for himself. We colored in comfortable silence for nearly 20 minutes. Occasionally he glanced toward me to compare our pictures, smiling each time he noticed we had chosen different shades for the same tree. That looks beautiful, I whispered. He looked at his drawing for several seconds before writing something in the corner of the page with careful block letters. Home. My chest tightened. It is, I answered. Footsteps approached from behind us. Adrian had entered the ballroom without either of us noticing. He stood watching Ethan's drawing with quiet attention. The little boy looked up at him, then back at the page before doing something neither of us expected. He held the drawing out toward Adrian with both hands. Adrian accepted it as though someone had just entrusted him with the rarest treasure in the world. Did you make this for me? Ethan gave one small nod. Adrian swallowed before speaking again. Thank you. The boy looked toward me, took a careful breath, and managed another whisper that sounded steadier than before. For us. Adrian closed his eyes for just a moment, overwhelmed by two simple words that carried more hope than any speech ever could. At that exact moment one of the security officers entered the ballroom and quietly approached Adrian. He leaned close enough to avoid disturbing Ethan before speaking in a low voice. I could not hear every word, only the final sentence. Sir, Victor has arrived early. He is asking to meet with you alone. Adrian thanked the security officer with a quiet nod before folding Ethan's drawing with extraordinary care and slipping it inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Keep coloring, he told the little boy gently. I will not be long. Ethan looked uncertain but nodded anyway. Adrian rested one reassuring hand on his shoulder before following the officer out of the ballroom. The doors closed softly behind them. The room suddenly felt much larger. I remained beside Ethan, helping him choose colors for another page while the rescue dog slept peacefully at our feet. Every few minutes Ethan glanced toward the hallway as though measuring how much time had passed. I recognized that look. It was the expression of someone who had learned to wait without asking questions. Nearly half an hour later, Evelyn entered carrying a silver tray filled with iced tea and fresh fruit. Her smile appeared the moment she saw Ethan coloring. "He has not spent this long in the ballroom in years," she whispered to me while setting the tray on a nearby table. "You have brought something back that this house almost forgot." Before I could respond, voices drifted in from the corridor outside. They were calm, but sharper than before. One belonged to Adrian. The other belonged to Victor. I could not make out every word, only scattered fragments carried through the partially open doors. Trust. Family. Future. Then silence returned. A few minutes later Victor stepped into the ballroom alone. His tailored navy suit looked as immaculate as ever, and his familiar pleasant smile never left his face. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. Ethan immediately lowered his eyes to the coloring book. Victor noticed but did not comment. Instead, he turned toward me. "Claire, would you mind helping me for just a moment?" I stood politely. "Of course. There is a photograph in the East Gallery that I would like moved before tonight's guests arrive. Evelyn is busy, and I believe you have a careful eye." I glanced toward Evelyn, but she had already been called into the kitchen by another employee. It seemed like an ordinary request. "I will only be a minute," I assured Ethan. He looked up at me, then quietly reached for the sleeve of my uniform. His fingers tightened for just a second before letting go. Something about that tiny gesture unsettled me. Even the rescue dog lifted his head, watching Victor with unusual attention. We walked together through the long east corridor lined with family portraits and polished hardwood floors. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, filling the hallway with warm light. Victor spoke pleasantly as we walked. "You have adjusted remarkably well to this household." "Everyone has been kind to me," I answered honestly. "Not everyone," he replied with a faint smile. "Some people simply hide their opinions better than others." We stopped outside the East Gallery. The room beyond was empty except for rows of paintings and antique furniture covered in soft golden light. I stepped inside expecting to see the photograph he had mentioned. Instead, every picture already hung perfectly straight. "Which one needs moving?" I asked. Victor remained near the doorway. "None of them." I slowly turned toward him. His smile had faded into something quieter, more thoughtful. I wanted a chance to speak without interruptions. My heartbeat quickened. "About what?" He folded his hands behind his back. "About Adrian." Before I could answer, the rescue dog came racing down the hallway at full speed. His paws echoed across the hardwood floor before he stopped directly beside me, pressing firmly against my leg with a low anxious whine. A second later Adrian's voice carried through the corridor, calm but unmistakably urgent. "Claire, step away from the doorway now." My body reacted before my mind did. The instant I heard Adrian's voice, I stepped backward without questioning why. The rescue dog moved with me, staying so close that his shoulder brushed against my leg. Victor remained perfectly still in the doorway, his expression calm enough that someone walking past might have believed nothing unusual was happening. Adrian reached us only seconds later, his pace controlled but unmistakably purposeful. Two members of the security team followed several steps behind him, stopping quietly at the entrance to the corridor. No one raised a voice. No one made a sudden movement. The silence carried more weight than any argument could have. Adrian's eyes met mine first. "Are you all right?" I nodded. "Yes." Only then did he turn toward Victor. "You asked my employee to leave the ballroom without informing anyone." Victor answered with effortless composure. "I asked for assistance with a private family matter." "I hardly imagined that would concern you." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "Everything that happens inside this house concerns me." Victor smiled faintly, almost sympathetically. "You have become suspicious of everyone." "Experience has taught me to notice patterns." Their conversation sounded less like a disagreement and more like two men playing a careful game where every sentence mattered. I suddenly understood why no one in the mansion ever interrupted either of them. Victor slowly reached inside the pocket of his jacket. Every security officer became noticeably more attentive, yet Adrian simply watched. A moment later Victor produced nothing more threatening than a folded envelope. He handed it toward Adrian. "Read it before tonight's meeting." Adrian accepted it without opening it. "Thank you." Victor gave one final glance in my direction. "Miss Bennet," he said politely, "continue noticing small details. They seem to favor you." Then he walked away at his usual unhurried pace until the sound of his footsteps disappeared around the corner. The corridor remained silent for several seconds after he left. Adrian waited until Victor was completely gone before turning back to me. "I owe you an apology." I blinked. "For what?" "For allowing you to become part of matters that should never have reached you." I shook my head. "You did not ask for any of this either." A quiet breath escaped him that almost sounded like a laugh. "You always answer the question I am not expecting." We began walking back toward the ballroom together while the rescue dog happily trotted between us, as though satisfied that whatever danger he had sensed was over. Halfway there, Adrian stopped beside one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Late afternoon sunlight covered the estate in warm gold. Gardeners continued trimming hedges. Birds circled above the fountain. From a distance everything looked peaceful. "Do you know why I hired so many people who had ordinary lives before coming here?" he asked. I shook my head. "Because ordinary people still recognize what normal feels like. They notice when something is out of place. Those of us who spend too many years surrounded by power sometimes forget the difference." I looked out across the gardens. "I do not think kindness is ordinary." Adrian was quiet for a long moment before answering. Neither did Emma. We reached the ballroom just as the evening guests began arriving. Soft music drifted through the house while conversations filled the grand entrance with polite laughter. Ethan spotted us immediately. Without hesitation, he ran across the room and wrapped both arms around Adrian's waist before looking up at me with a smile that no longer seemed hesitant. Then he reached into the pocket of his sweater, removed the faded blue and green friendship bracelet with Noah's name stitched across it, and carefully placed it in Adrian's hand. Father and son stared at it together in complete silence. Finally Ethan whispered, more clearly than I had ever heard before, "I remember her now, without it." People often believe that the biggest moments in life arrive with thunder, sirens, or headlines. They rarely do. Sometimes they arrive in the quiet sound of a child finding his voice again. The ballroom remained almost perfectly still after Ethan spoke. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one applauded. Adrian knelt in front of his son, holding the faded friendship bracelet carefully between both hands as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. His eyes glistened beneath the warm chandelier light, but his smile carried something stronger than grief. It carried peace. "She would be proud of you," he said softly. Ethan nodded before looking at me. "She would like you." The words were slow, careful, and beautifully imperfect. I felt my own eyes sting as I smiled back. "I wish I could have met her." Ethan looked toward the ceiling for a moment, thinking the way children often do when searching for exactly the right answer. Then he whispered, "I think you did. She taught Daddy to protect people." You reminded him why. Adrian closed his eyes for a brief second before standing again. Around us, guests continued arriving, conversations gradually returning to the room as though life itself understood that hope deserved privacy. The evening passed with surprising calm. Victor attended the gathering, spoke politely with everyone, and left before dessert without another private conversation. Whatever had been written inside the envelope Adrian received remained between the two of them. I never asked about it, and he never volunteered an explanation. Somehow we both understood that trust sometimes grows stronger when curiosity learns patience. Weeks became months. The mansion slowly changed in ways that could not be measured with photographs. Laughter appeared more often in the hallways. The reading room was used almost every evening. Ethan began speaking in complete sentences, first to Adrian, then to Evelyn, and eventually to every member of the household. The rescue dog never left his side. Even the garden seemed brighter, filled with new flowers planted where empty spaces had once been. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after my first day at the estate, I stood beneath the same oak trees that had welcomed me through the front gates. My old Honda Civic was parked nearby, freshly washed but still proudly ordinary among the expensive cars surrounding it. Adrian joined me carrying a small wooden box. "There is something I would like you to have," he said. Inside rested the history book I had accidentally discovered on my first day, the one filled with handwritten notes from Emma. Tucked inside the front cover was a simple handwritten message. "A home is built twice. Once with stone. Once with the people who choose to stay." I looked up at him, unable to find words. "Emma believed books should never gather dust," he explained. "She would want someone to keep reading this one." I held the book carefully against my chest. "Thank you." Adrian smiled in that quiet way I had come to recognize, the smile that belonged not to a powerful man but to someone who had finally allowed himself to heal. Behind us the front door opened. Ethan came running across the lawn with the rescue dog racing beside him. "Claire," he called confidently, his voice carrying across the gardens without hesitation. "Come see what we planted." I followed him toward a small corner of the garden where 3 young oak trees stood in fresh soil beneath the afternoon sun. A wooden sign rested beside them. It read, "Emma, New Beginnings." Ethan slipped one small hand into mine and the other into Adrian's. None of us spoke for several moments. We simply stood together beneath a clear blue sky, listening to leaves rustle gently in the breeze. That was when I finally understood the first lesson this extraordinary house had tried to teach me. The strongest people are not the ones who build the highest walls. They are the ones who leave the gate open for hope to walk back in.